Okay guys, in this video we're going to talk about functions. Now functions, you might have learned in math class at one point. Do you remember this old thing? You probably have some terrible memories of this, right? The f of x in math class. It's going to be a lot cooler in programming than it was in math class, I can promise you that. So in math, you may have learned this f of x idea, and that is just a way of saying you take an input, you do something to that input, and you return an output, which is basically the end result of this manipulation. So what does that mean? So let's say you take a function. You pass in 0. That's the input. You multiply 0 by 2, you output 0. Same deal, if you put 1 times it by 2, comes back as 2, right? Pretty straightforward, pretty simple. So in programming, we have the same thing, and it's used all over the place. It is a required learning. You have to know how functions work, and it's pretty easy. I'll show you. So in JavaScript, you just type function, and then you can name that function. You can call it anything you want. I'm going to call it my function. We're going to put parentheses, just like the f of x, right? Because that's essentially what's happening here. You have f, and then your parameter is x. So we can actually put something inside of these parentheses, a parameter, and it can be anything we want. You could, x or a string you pass in, or anything, Then we make a block, and inside this block we manipulate the input. So, well, here, let's do this. We're just going to pass in x. We're just going to return something, and the return statement ends the function. It ends the function and returns whatever you've done to the input. So x plus 1, for example. So just to show you what I mean, if I typed anything after this, like print, this is nonsense. If I put this here, understand the compiler will never actually, the compiler will never actually read this print because it stops reading after return. It's good to know. So I can call this function, and I'll put this inside of a console log. I'll separate it out to where you can see what's going on. So here's the function. I'm just calling it. I can just call it just like this, but I have to put the parentheses. So if I called my function just like this, it's actually not going to run the function. You're essentially just calling the concept of this function. Like the compiler recognizes that there is a function called my function, but unless you put the parentheses there, it doesn't actually run it. So you could do 5. We're going to pass in 5 to this function. And so what's going to happen is we've passed in 5. When we call this, it's going to go through, it's going to return 5 plus 1. So let's see. Look at that, 6. Interesting stuff, huh? Now it's also interesting to know we actually don't even need a parameter if we don't want one. And there is some valid use cases for this. A lot of times, let's say you have some really complex logic and you want just a good way to return that logic like a variable, but it's like you can imagine that, let's say you have something that's too complex to really store in a variable and it just doesn't make sense to store it in a variable. You can use a function, and a function will basically act like a variable in that sense, and that it will return that complex logic. And there's not a good example I can think of here for our very simple use case, but understand when you get further into programming, you're going to come across stuff like that. You could come across a problem that's very complex and requires many different things. So you can do this. So I could pass nothing into this, and we're just going to say return 5 plus, something crazy like that, and return some big number. And so you actually don't need parameters. Another thing that's very important to know is, you can pass multiple parameters into here. Let's say x, y, and z. And then we can return x plus y plus z. Now, when you call it, understand that the order of which you pass in your parameters corresponds to what they will be inside the function. So it's essentially, you can pass it in like this, 10, 12, -1, right? So what that means is that when you pass these in, 10 is going to be x inside this function, 12 is going to be y, and then -1 is going to be z. You see what I mean? And you can also, you can do this if you wanted to, x equals y equals, just to be clear, although it's usually not necessary to do that, but just to show you, just to show you what I mean. So when we return this, we get 21, and that is the answer. Okay, cool. So what does that look like in other languages? Now in Python, it's pretty easy. So in Python, we use def. I'm just going to print this out here. Def equals define. So when we write def, what we're saying is define. We're going to say my function, and that's the name, of course. Do x colon, and then in Python we use tabs. So we'll do return. Oops, excuse me. So now let's do and we'll put, I don't know, 10 in there. Output's 11. What about Ruby? Well, Ruby, very similar to Python, we still use define. We'll say my function, put end. So we don't have brackets in Ruby. So one thing, so we can put return in here, but in Ruby you don't have to. In Ruby, the last line of a function is always returned. So we could do x plus 1. $25. What about some PHP? Now in PHP, we're going to type out function just like in JavaScript. PHP, your variables always have to have a $sign. Always have to have semicolons. So now we can do print. We have to have semicolons. Let me forget that. We can even pass in a math equation if we wanted to. Let's see if that works. 1 plus 2 plus 12. 15. Cool. What about a language that we haven't really touched on? What about Rust? Now Rust is what do they call it? Like a compiling language. It's a systems programming language. It's a language that's it's far closer to the CPU. It's a lot like something like C++, which is it's a lot more complex. This is the sort of language that takes another language like Ruby and compiles it down into binary. Like it is it's far closer to the CPU, and that usually makes the syntax a little bit more complex. So it looks like it just by default it actually gives you a function. But, let's write our own. I think I may have to learn a little bit of this myself. I'm by no means a Rust expert, but let's try it. So we'll do my function, and I believe in Rust you have to. So let's say if we passed in x, I think you have to define what kind of type x is. Like in the other languages we've dealt with, we dealt with types, but a lot of times the types were handled for us. That like the compiler already knew or had a good idea of what kind of types we were dealing with already, so we didn't actually have to define it ourselves. But in Rust, you have to define it, and I think it has multiple different kinds of integers, for instance, like 1, right? So in this case, we would use, I think, let's try this. It's I32. I think it's like I16, I32, 64, and it has to deal with the number of bytes that are in the integer. And we're getting a little bit more of the complex stuff. We're just going to try I32. We're just going to print line. We have to have semicolons in Rust as well. This function will print. Let's see, how do we pass a variable inside of a string? I think it's, what's it, like this? And then let's see. Occam's razor. Always find the simplest explanation. That's usually the one you're looking for. Nope. Thing is not doing it for us, is it? Boom, here we go. Print line. Aha, okay, I knew that's what it was. I thought that's what it was. We're going to pass it in. So we're going to leave this empty. I'm just going to pass in x right here, and let's see what happens. We're going to print hello world, and then we're going to call my function and just see what happens. We're going to pass in 5. Oh man, it's doing something. It's doing something. I'm going to copy this and refresh it because it looks like something broke. Warning, function. Aha, it did work. This function will print 5. Cool. Look at that. So there's some warnings it gave us, but these aren't breaking. So yeah, it looks like the syntax, or the convention, it's not even really a syntax, but the convention in Rust is you're supposed to use underscores and not use, like for instance, in some languages, they like you to type like this. Some languages, they like you to type like this. And this is called snake case. This is called camel case because of the hump. You know, you see, my starts off little, and there's the big F looks like a hump, so they call it camel case. Snake case, it looks like it's low to the ground, you know. So this is constantly used in Python. So it looks like in Rust, it's very similar. You have to use snake case. So if you run that again, that should go away. All right, we have to change this to here. Look at that, perfect. Cool, cool. All right, guys. Hope you guys enjoyed this. Hope you learned something. Thanks for watching.